This morning I'm going to talk about the reaction of the Britain's trade union movement and the universities to Operation Protective Edge, and also about its effect on the conflict of the effect of the conflict on Anglo-Jewry, because unlike any previous conflicts involving Israel, this one impacted directly on the community. And what I'm trying to do is frame my talk in terms of the biggest threat that Anglo-Jewry faces in the years ahead, which is anti-Semitism. I realise that Israel is not directly affected by increasing anti-Semitism in Europe, as you have your own problems, especially having to deal with hostile neighbours bent on Israel's destruction. But for more than 10 years, both the trade unions and our university campuses have been used for the promotion of the BDS movement directed against Israel. My union, the UCU, was behind the promotion of an academic boycott. Left-wing trade union activists are the founders of the Stop the War movement in Britain, which sprang up at the time of the Iraq War. They're still in existence, and along with radical Islamic groups, they ensure that London is a centre for delegitimisation of the State of Israel. Our universities have seen a wide range of speakers on campus on promoting solidarity with the Palestinian cause, and they include the Palestine Solidarity Campaign and NGOs such as War on Want and Amnesty International. This summer we can see that, with hindsight, we were actually fortunate that the war started in the summer when our universities were closed, and it was after the annual trade union conference season. In fact, there was only one conference outstanding, which was the TUC, which is the British equivalent of the Histadrut, and that took place after the conflict had ended in September. In Britain we have an organisation called the Community Security Trust, which organises security for our community, synagogues, protecting synagogues, etc., etc. And they recorded 302 anti-Semitic incidents in July 2014, which was a rise of over 400% from the 59 incidents recorded in July 2013, and only slightly fewer than the 304 incidents recorded in the entire first 6 months of 2014. However, of those 300 or so incidents, 101 involved the use of language or imagery relating to the Holocaust. The most common reference that was used was to Hitler or the Holocaust, and it was used to taunt or offend Jews, often in relation to those events which were going on in Gaza. And most of it was used on social media, and Twitter especially, using the hashtag Hitler was right. According to the CST, their figures, 76 of those 302 events, 25%, took place on social media. What you have to realise is that for the CST to record an event as an incident as anti-Semitic, they have to be 100% sure that it is an anti-Semitic incident. So if they say there were 300 incidents, they are what I would call hardcore events, hardcore incidents. Interestingly, if you compare the statistics for those 3 weeks in July, I don't have the August figures by the way, for July, if you compare it with what happened at Operation Cast Lead 5 years ago, there was 288 recorded incidents, which is not much less than what we had this summer. And Operation Cast Lead took place in the winter, and our universities we had to put up with over 30 student occupations took place on campus in support of the Palestinians and what was happening in Gaza. And I wrote at the time, there were at least 50 anti-Israel demonstrations around the UK since the start of the 2009 crisis. While most of the demonstrators voiced their protest in entirely legitimate ways, there have been several examples of anti-Semitic chanting on anti-Israel demonstrations and the use of Jewish rather than specifically Israeli symbols on placards. Anti-Semitic chants included shouts of Heil Hitler, dirty Jews go to hell, and kill the Jews. So we didn't realise it at the time, but effectively what happened this time was exactly the same in Britain. But the difference was that it was a lot more on social media. A common theme of the anti-Israel rhetoric used was that to equate Nazi Germany and Gaza with the Warsaw Ghetto. It was encouraged by leaders of anti-Israel protests, including George Galloway MP, who you've no doubt heard of, and a pro-Hamas speaker, Azam Tamimi. The British Muslim Initiative, one of the main organisers of the demonstrations in support of the Palestinians, used the campaigning slogan, "Stop the Holocaust in Gaza." Now, we know that comparison has no factual basis and it's grossly inoffensive to Jews, yet it was widely used throughout the 7 weeks of the conflict. There were so many tweets and postings on social media that it was impossible to respond to them all. In a way, it was like the little boy with his finger in the dike. He took his finger out and it exploded. And the majority of these comments on Twitter and social media were of a low-level anti-Semitic comments, but they wouldn't make the CST hardcore level. It wouldn't. When the CST says these are how many incidents that's actually occurred, it's slightly misleading because everybody ignores this low level of anti-Semitism. There was a recent example, and this took place only last week, when a senior Conservative MP, Sir Alan Duncan, was interviewed over the Palestine vote in Parliament. He said that America was dominated by a very powerful financial lobby. It just moved on. The interviewer just moved on, didn't make any comment. But if you think about it, 10 years ago, even 5 years ago, those sort of comments would have been challenged. And it takes a brave interviewer to actually challenge somebody who makes comments like that on the radio. So in my view, what actually happened, why there was such a sort of effect on the community, was because there was a series of factors all came together at one point from this war. London was the centre of delegitimisation. There was the conflation of anti-Israel and anti-Jewish and anti-Israel hatred. There was the increased use of social media and an anti-Israel narrative promoted by the media, the BBC, the newspapers, and these all combined to ensure there was an upsurge in anti-Semitism, which was the longest period of sustained anti-Semitism in Europe since the Second World War. Fortunately, in London, or in Britain, we were better off than they were in France because we didn't have any anti-Jewish riots. But the result on our community was that it brought them together in a way that we hadn't seen since the '67 war. I attended a local meeting. There were so many local meetings from our communities up and down the country. I come from a place called Southend, and I was invited back to talk in a meeting. It's now probably only about 1,000 Jews live in Southend or thereabouts, and the organisers only expected 75 people to turn up. 200 members of the community turned up because they were so concerned, and this was repeated throughout Britain, in terms of ordinary people wanting to get involved who don't normally get involved. Another effect that was that many Jews, including members of my own family, considered whether we had a future in Britain. We actually discussed with one of our sons who came to us and said, should we be worried and thinking about moving? The moments passed, and I think a lot of people were shocked by what had happened, right? And they still are. What happens today at our universities and in our trade unions has a direct bearing on our lives. Not tomorrow, but what happens now will affect the lives of the next generation in about 20 to 30 years' time. If we think back to the 1970s and the 1980s, this was the time of the infamous 1975 UN Zionism is Racism resolution and the anti-apartheid campaign directed at South Africa. This was the political background of those people who are in power today, in positions of responsibility. They're the decision makers in the media and politics, and this was their background at their time in university, and and also at grassroots activism within the trade union movement. So these people are in positions of power now. So is it really any wonder that the BBC's reporting of the Gaza conflict was seen by so many Jews as biased? Because that was how they were brought up. And my fear is that the students currently at universities are being subjected to anti-Zionist rhetoric such as Israel's a racist state, Israel is an apartheid state, the Israelis are Nazis. So think about it, how are they going to react in 25 years' time when Israel is in the news once again? You know, that's really one of my concerns. Turning to the universities as such, believe it or not, there are 134 universities in Britain, but only about 75 of them have Jewish or Israel societies. The most popular universities for Jewish students are the London universities, Manchester, Leeds and Nottingham. We know, or we think we know, that the situation is getting worse on campus for Jewish students, but we don't have the figures to back it up. I was actually shocked when I asked the question, who knows how many anti-Israel events are there on campus each week? Nobody could actually tell me. The Jewish Students' Organisation couldn't tell me, nor could the Community Security Trust. And it's important that we actually have this information, because if we have this information, we'll know which are the bad universities for Jewish students, and we'll know where we can put our resources in, for example. And also we can publish reports. So, because nobody else is doing it, Academic Friends of Israel, my wife and I, we've said that's what we're going to do this year. We're going to start doing. We have no idea how big a project it's going to be. It could turn out to take up all our time. We don't know. So all we can roughly say at the moment is that there are probably between 3 and 5 anti-Israel, anti-Zionist, BDS type events on campus every week in Britain. But we have no figures to back that up, right? But it's a guesstimate, right? It's very difficult for students if you want to stand up for Israel, because because our campuses tend to be a breeding ground for contemporary anti-Semitism, because those student societies that identify with the Palestinian cause, they express their opposition to Israel by using these anti-Israel rhetoric, which invokes anti-Semitic tropes. Although they don't intend it to be anti-Semitic, the effect is to harass students, and the students, especially those who support Israel, and most of whom happen to be Jewish. I will add that many students go through university and keep their head down, like the community. They're effectively like the community. They keep their head down. So you can do it. But if you are concerned and want to stand up, it's very, very hard. One of the effects of all this is that nobody really understands what contemporary anti-Semitism is, and that includes everyone on campus. For example, vice-chancellors, the students, the academics, the unions. Everybody's got a different view of what anti-Semitism is. I've heard it said that several vice-chancellors of our universities say that there is no anti-Semitism on campus. Other vice-chancellors, I've been told, say anti-Semitism doesn't affect the community as a whole, it just is just directed at individuals. They don't understand it. According to Matthew Gould, the British ambassador to Israel, he says that there's only 6 universities where it's a real problem. Now, I don't know whether he's talking about hardcore anti-Semitism or whether he's talking about the low-level stuff. I think it's a lot more common on campus than we want to believe. Right? You've only got to go to university student Facebook pages or Twitter feeds and see those sort of comments. It's all low-level stuff, but it's out there, and it's affecting us. Now, the community could do 2 things, and I'm very passionate about both of them. We need to educate our university vice-chancellors. We need to make them understand what contemporary anti-Semitism is and how the criticism of Israel invokes and uses anti-Semitic tropes. They need to be able to distinguish between legitimate criticism of Israel and how actions and policies avoid these tropes. They need to be made aware of the problems conflating the terms Jew and Israel and Jew. One of the we need to show them where that crosses, where free speech crosses that line into anti-Semitism, because one of the classic arguments of the left is that pro-Israel activists like me, Richard here, we use the anti-Semitism card to stifle criticism of Israel, and I've been accused of that many times. Our university administrations need to be reminded that they have a duty of care towards our students in terms of legislation. They have to, or they are supposed to take steps to eliminate harassment, to foster good relations between students of different ethnic groups or religious beliefs, by tackling prejudice and promoting understanding. And these requirements apply to Jewish students who are protected as an ethnic group, irrespective of their religious beliefs. At the moment, many students, Jewish students, don't believe that universities take their complaints seriously. But by instituting a programme to educate vice-chancellors, I hope that this can be put together. I'm in contact with the leaders of our community, and they're saying the usual, don't worry, we've got it in hand, we're covered, we'll do it. Right? for that means they're working behind the scenes, but they can't tell you because they're working behind the scenes. But my guess is they're not doing a great deal. Right? We're actually concerned about what's going to happen on campus this term. And so far, it doesn't look that good. At the beginning of August, the National Union of Students, the main student body, voted to adopt an anti-Israel boycott and divestment and sanctions policy. This motion allows student unions throughout the UK to boycott Israeli products and services on campus, including Israeli sporting, cultural and academic institutions. So far we haven't heard if any local student union is going to move on this boycott motion. Last month the National Union of Students, they rejected an attempt to deny Jewish students, only Jewish students, the right to complain if they felt they had been victims of a racist act such as anti-Semitism. The motion was worded that Jewish students have made false claims of anti-Semitism, and fortunately it was defeated because the president of the National Union of Students, a good lady, she says if other minority groups are allowed to complain of harassment, then Jews should also be, and it was fortunately voted out. Next week, Manchester University students vote on a proposal to twin their union with the Palestinian University of Al-Najah. Najah, right? And their student union is dominated by Hamas. Their YouTube and Facebook pages glorify suicide bombers and terrorists. You know, the Jewish students are fighting the good fight. Hopefully, it will be defeated, but we don't know. I mean, to give you just what I'm saying, what I said before about everybody knows, the students should be treated properly. They wanted to have the vote originally on Shemoneh Atzeres, right? And that was defeated by the students. It was changed. Last week, Goldsmiths Students' Union in London, they had a motion which was proposed to commemorate Holocaust Memorial Day and other victims of genocide. You think, no problem. Students didn't. They rejected it on the grounds that it was Eurocentric and colonialist. Right. Now, my final thing about the students, I think sums up where we are in Britain today, in politically correct, multicultural Britain. The National Union students last week voted against a motion to condemn ISIS and support the Kurdish resistance. They voted against it on the grounds that the motion was Islamophobic. Right?
Which is interesting because the Kurds are Muslim.
Right? Yeah, but decent. Right?
They're not vicious enough.
Right? Anyway, that was our students, and I think that sums up what our community is up against, and it sums up what Britain is effectively today. Very concerned about Islamophobia, Islam, and sadly not a great deal concerned about the Jews because we're only a very small minority. Right, 300,000 thereabouts, and I think it's about 3 million Muslims. Right. So, moving on.
So it's the same proportion as French Jews to French Muslims. Just twice the number.
Much more.
10 times.
10 times more.
Yes, 10 times.
Officially,
No, not 10 times.
officially 5 million. We're talking about 8 to 10 million.
Yes, 10 to 12.
Okay. But as you can understand, we are a very small minority. Actually, in 1945, the Jews were the largest minority group in Britain. Right? There was no, and everybody else came under the Jews in the list. Now the Jews are about 6th or 7th in terms of minority groups in Britain. Moving on to the trade unions. Many people have assumed that because the British Labour Party has been very supportive over the years, then so were their partners in the British Labour movement, the TUC and the unions. Sadly, I discovered in my research that that is not true, because since 1945 the TUC, which has never been very never been very publicly supportive of Israel or the Histadrut, apart from one very short period from about 1965 to 73. In fact, they were so supportive that the British Foreign Office was trying to undermine the TUC because it went against British policy. But apart from that, unlike the American trade unions, which come out all the time and say supporting Israel, the British trade union movement has not been very supportive of Israel at all. About probably 15, 20 years ago, the Palestine Solidarity Campaign started to lobby the trade union movement in Britain. And over the years, they've gradually signed up more and more of the leading unions. And they now have the support of 13 of the largest unions. The TUC itself held back from backing PSC policy until 2010, when it launched a campaign to boycott goods from the settlements. The TUC issued a statement at the beginning of this summer's war, which could have been written by the PSC themselves or any other group which supports Hamas. Their statement used the language of the BDS movement, and it appeals to the liberal left because they put into it international law, human rights, universal justice, and they used the terms like apartheid and racism. This was the statement that they all issued, basically all the unions, especially those allied to the PSC, issued at the beginning of the war. Right? This was, if you can all see, this was a poster for one of the many demonstrations they had. Look where it started, outside the BBC, because they believe that the BBC is biased against the Palestinians and pro-Israel. Right? At the bottom you will see various logos for various organisations. The one on the this one is the PSC itself, which you can make out shows Israel and Greater Israel. Yep. This is Stop the War. This is CND, harking back to nuclear disarmament. God knows what they want to know about support Israel. British Muslim Initiative and various other groups. This is Friends of Al-Aqsa, right? These plus all the trade unions, right? But these were the main organisers for this for these rallies, and there were several of them. I'll come back to that. I'll come back to that in a minute. But the TUC raised the stakes further when they held their Congress last month. They issued a statement which was highly controversial in a way, but they've said that they will lobby the international trade union movement on behalf of the international BDS campaign. I think that's something very serious, something that we need to be concerned about. It positions the TUC firmly in the anti-Israel BDS camp and as a key supporter of Hamas. So you can see deplores annexations, deplores the attack on UN facilities, right? Condemns the collective punishment, and it goes on, right? There's more. It welcomes Hamas joining the PA government. It doesn't consider that the British government's response was acceptable. I like the one at the last one. TUC calls on Israel to pay for the rebuilding of Gaza. I like that. You know, only a trade union could put that in their sort of manifesto. TUC commits BDS, right? They want to pressurise companies involved in the settlements, occupation and the war and arms trading. Arms trading, they want to stop arms sales from Britain to Israel. Little do they realise how much comes the other way, right? Because the British forces with using Israeli drone technology couldn't exist in Afghanistan or whatever without the Israeli input. Trade unions, something actually to do with trade unions. PGFTU is the Palestinian trade union movement, and they will visit Gaza as soon as practical. They haven't been to Israel, they haven't been to see the Palestinians since probably, I think it's 2010. They don't want to come because of the security situation. Right? And right at the very end, oh, by the way, we deplore racism, discrimination and hate crimes of any form, including anti-Semitism such as attacks on synagogues. You know, you ask yourself, hang on, where did that come from? They don't mean it. It's like nonsense, because you know that these attacks they're talking about came about because of the conflict, but it sort of it goes against what they've previously said, and they sort of ignore that. Right? It condemns the TUC condemns Israel's actions, and there's no mention of Hamas rockets. There's no mention of Israel's right to defend themselves, and there's no mention of the use of civilians as human shields. And of course, there's no mention of their brothers in the international trade union movement, the Histadrut, right? Because effectively they've broken off relations with the Histadrut probably since 2010. Right? The TUC is actually has a very good name in terms of the international trade union movement. It always has done, but that's basically all it has, is a name, and people are, look to it to do things. It's done very little. It doesn't send people abroad. It doesn't. It's typical British trade union movement. Put your hand up and say we support it, but they do very little in terms of stuff on the ground.
Sort of like a Monty Python.
Yeah, could be. Sadly, Anglo-Jury's connections with the TUC and the trade union movement have been limited in recent years to what I said before with the students. They've been working behind the scenes. And I'm being a bit flippant about it, but in a way it's true. Their input was an annual dinner held before the TUC Congress for certain leaders of the trade union movement who were friendly towards the Jews. Right? We do have what's called the Trade Union Friends of Israel. It's a very small group. They do the best they can. They are limited resources. The community has not funded them the way it should be, but in a way they're fighting a losing battle, because the main trade union movement is now signed up with the Palestine Solidarity Campaign. But I don't believe we should give up. I believe we should do it, but we need to educate the people what is really happening on the ground, what it means, what all these statements mean. No, I'm looking for it. Right. The National Union of Teachers Union. They are a typical union. They are probably the most active PSC aligned union. They have a bi-monthly magazine that comes out, and every issue has something about Gaza in it, or Gaza or the Palestinians. This is found on. You can find this on the web. This is what they wrote. I've just got the headings. Solidarity in action, help the Palestinians who've unfortunately suffered in the recent war. They're very keen on supporting the campaign for about mistreatment of Palestinian children. That was in June. That was they adopted that in June 2014. Help save our kid from destruction and forced eviction. I don't know. I know very little about that. It's the 10th anniversary of what they call Israel's apartheid wall. So support, write to your MPs, campaign against that. G4S is a security company. They want to stop using. They want to stop the British end. It's a British-owned company. They want to stop them in Israel. Stop UK arms to Israel. Stop the arms, stop the killing, act for Palestinian children. This comes out, their magazine comes out every 2 months. It's sent to, I think, it's well in excess of 100,000 teachers, right? And they signed up. And the sad thing is, 10 years ago when I started this activism, the General Secretary then was very pro-Israel. And he had a very good relationship with the Israeli Teachers Union, right? And sadly he died. And since then, the relationship between the Israeli Teachers Union and the National Union of Teachers has gone, right? A quick word about my legal action. I accuse my union of anti-Semitism, institutional anti-Semitism. How are we doing for time? Right.
10 minutes.
Okay, right. I lost. Even though I lost my claim, the unions have been fairly quiet in what I would call anti-Israel activity until now, because they've realised that they no longer have free rein to do what they wanted to do. They've looked at their constitutions. They've looked at the legal opinions that the trade union movement received, especially about the boycott, and realised, hang on a minute, if somebody challenges them, like I did, my union, then it could be a problem. Now, it's not against the law for individuals to boycott Israeli goods or whatever. You can do whatever you like. But when it comes to organisations, right, you cannot promote a boycott of Israel. Right? You have to be very careful about what you do. Now, goods from Greater Israel, Judea and Samaria, right, they can boycott those goods, because I've been told that region has no status in international law, so they cannot. They're
I thought
free.
they were illegal.
So that's why the TUC, that's why the trade union movement, that's why everybody can focus on that. But when it comes to boycotting goods from a sovereign state, then they have to be very careful, which is why I'm watching what the students' boycott will do. We learned two things from my judgment, from the judgment against me. Firstly, that not everyone, especially non-Jews, know that the connection between the land of Israel, Jews and the book goes back 3,000 years. And secondly, we do not have a definition of anti-Semitism that we Jews can refer to. And I'm trying whenever I can to tell people these are the two issues that are important. And the judgment actually, the bit about the link between Jews and Israel, that was actually specifically mentioned in the judgment. The judge says there is no connection between Jews and what he called the Zionist project. Right? On a personal note, I have, as a result of losing the case, my lawyers and I are now facing a claim from the union for costs of nearly $1 million. Right? And the claim is due to be heard by the court in December. We shall see. I don't have $1 million, and we'll see. We'll see what happens. Right? Anyway. A couple of other points which I'll sum up on. It's not against the law to be an anti-Semite in Britain. Right. We have a law called racial incitement, which means that if I call you a dirty Jew and all Jews are racist, that's fine. There's no problem with that, because that's just political rhetoric or freedom of speech. I can say that. But if I say you're a dirty Jew and Jews are racist and we should kill all the Jews, that's racial incitement. Right? So, and according to the CST, there were an average of 600 anti-Semitic incidents every year between 2008 and 2012. It's about 10 a week. But in that same period of time, those same 4 years, there were only on average 10 successful prosecutions a year, right, for racial incitement. That doesn't sound right to me. However, I've since been told that we're doing pretty well in Britain with 10, right, compared to some other countries. We need a definition of anti-Semitism. There is one out there. It's called the EUMC definition, but our leadership, the border deputies, are at the moment not very keen to adopt it. I personally think we should have a definition, because even if it hasn't got any legal standing, we should be able to point the finger and say, according to our definition of anti-Semitism, you are an anti-Semite, or that's an anti-Semitic act. Right? We're not unusual, actually, in Britain, because there are a lot of communities that don't officially have a definition of anti-Semitism. But I think we're getting to the point where we have to fight back and say, you are an anti-Semite because of our definition. One of my arguments with the union was, I believed in the EUMC definition, which includes reference to Israel. And my union said, when I argued with them, well, that's not our definition. We don't believe that. So, you know, if somebody says that they don't believe it, how do you square the circle? You can't. So we have to adopt this strategy. The latest I've been told is that our community is going to adopt the European attitude of it's up to the victim to define if they've been subjected to an anti-Semitic act. And I think this will lead to more problems, because everybody's definition of anti-Semitism is different. Right? So it's we will get there. I wanted to show you. Oh, hang on, I've lost it. Little banners at one of the demonstrations. Nobody complained. Right? The police were there. They saw what was happening. Did they go in? No. Right? On the grounds that they were they could cause more trouble if they went and arrested the people who were there. Right?
Did anybody ask them to go in?
I don't know. Right? They say, the CST tell me that the police were videoing the event, and we'll identify these people at later time, maybe, right? And we will see, you know, what happens. I will say though that the organisers of the event, the one that similar poster, the subsequent demonstrations, they policed them and made sure that those sort of banners were not shown. So they were aware of the problem, that anti-Semitism was going to reduce the effect of their demonstration. I personally don't think that the number of people they had out on the street were a lot. I think a lot of them were the hardcore activists compared with Stop the War in 2002. And finally, I've been looking at Facebook. I've been looking at Facebook likes, and to me, this gives you an indicator of where we stand in Britain as Jews, and it gives you an indicator of the problem. Oh, lost it again, haven't I? Sorry. Huh?
Oh, more room here. Just go down.
Right. Facebook likes. It's not an accurate figure, but it's an indicator. PSC, nearly 400,000 likes. The figures can be Stop the War, 100,000. C&D, 49,000.
C&D is...
Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament,
Oh, right.
the 1950s. Friends of Al-Aqsa mentioned 334,000. Right? War on Want, 24,000. Israeli Embassy in London, 11,000. Board of Deputies, 195. Right, they're really on the ball, aren't they?
You forgot the zeros.
Right, the Jewish Leadership Council, 297. Right. The rally that was organised against anti-Semitism at the Law Court, which you may have read about in Britain, was organised by grassroots activism. Nearly 6,000 likes. It's not an accurate, but it's an indication that this last conflict, it was social media that where everything was happening. The Board of Deputies, I'm sorry to say, the leadership of our community, they did what they normally do on a crisis. They did the rounds of the media, issued statements, but they forgot about the grassroots. They forgot about their community. Their community were worried. The activists, the grassroots activists who are on Twitter, who are on Facebook, they organised the campaign. They organised the rallies. There was one in Manchester, one in Brighton. This in London against anti-Semitism, grassroots. The Tricycle Theatre, led by the activists. There's a Kedem store in Manchester which sells Israeli products. There's a weekly demonstration outside there. The activists organised that. You know, it's a phenomena that I think is possibly going throughout the Western world, where grassroots activism is sort of sidelining the leadership and moving on. But I think this gives you a very good idea, ladies and gentlemen, of the problem we face in Britain. That's it.
Okay, let's. Would you like to field the questions, or would you like me to keep track of who's got their hands up?
I don't.
Well, why don't we start in the back?
Okay, Howard Wise Band. Two questions. One, you mentioned a few times that unfortunately we don't have a definition of anti-Semitism. Robert Wistrich is recognized as one of the foremost experts. What's his definition? I've read some of his stuff, but I
don't know.
Well, we should know.
I don't know.
We should know.
I don't know.
Hey, all right, so my other question is, it kind of moves to a bit of a bigger picture, but is there any indirect reference or influence from what you've been speaking about? A few words, perhaps, your analysis of the recent vote in Parliament, and is there an impact from all of what you've been saying to influence that vote?
I've been out of the country. I've been in Israel since they had the vote. Right? Is it going to make a difference? I think the response from our leadership, again, was abysmal. Right? The only good thing they actually did, they have a desk called We Believe in Israel, which is in contact with local groups, local members of the community, and they ask them to contact their MPs. I haven't seen any, and it may just be me, I haven't seen any press statements or anything from the Conservative Friends of Israel, the Liberal Friends of Israel, or the Labour Friends of Israel. Might just be me, I might have just missed it, but I think there hasn't been a lot. I could say they've been working behind the scenes, but I don't know.
That's right. No, actually they did the wrong thing. Because the message was that the Israeli embassy decided to downplay the vote because it was going to be passed anyway, and the best thing was to downplay it. In fact, on the day of the vote, I passed the Israeli ambassador to the UK, Daniel Taub, and the Rakevit. So it was that important that the ambassador was actually in Israel. And the Jewish community made the mistake of going and telling people to campaign against it without consulting with the Israeli embassy. So whoever was right or wrong, what was wrong was there was no coordination between the community and the embassy. That was what I was really wrong about.
And you could not stop it.
That is a serious problem. There is coordination of sometimes. On my own personal experience, the embassy in 2005, 2006 were absolutely brilliant for me. I got more support from the embassy at that time when my union was promoting the boycott than I did from the community. Right? I fight two battles: one against the community, and one in a way, and we are not all on the same page. And there is this disconnect between local grassroots activism in Britain and the leadership. Right? As that slide shows. Going back to your definition about Robert Wistrich, Robert is a well-respected academic, and the EUMC definition is accepted and used by law enforcement authorities throughout the world. It's in the police handbook. So going back to that poster, that picture, they know it is anti-Semitic because it's in the police handbook of what they're supposed to do. But it has no legal backing. Parliamentarians want it. Everybody supports it in a way that some of the main figures, our community don't. Sorry.
I was in Scotland all summer, and you didn't discuss it. I wondered if you would relate to the incidents that happened where both in Edinburgh and in Glasgow, the city councils flew the Palestinian flag, what happened at the Edinburgh Festival where an Israeli group was not able to perform, and the whole business of the Scottish Nationalist Party and the independents and the hint that there was anti-Semitism.
How long have you got? Scotland has always been very, very anti-Israel. George Galloway started in Scotland. Dundee has always been the centre of anti-Israel, pro-Palestinian activity. Right? I can't really say a great deal about it in a few minutes to do justice to it, but the dance group, the Zionist Federation, very quickly picked up on them.
Yes.
And booked them in other auditorium in Britain. Right? The leadership were not involved in that. That was a sort of activist-led moving of them. The independence vote, I think that in itself will have repercussions in terms of the whole structure of what will happen in England and Britain in future, because the English were extremely worried. They suddenly realised 2 days before the vote, hang on a minute, Scotland could actually secede from the Union. We were very concerned, and they were going, hang on, why is it just a straight majority? Why is it not a sort of 75% majority? Right? They suddenly realised, and I think that in terms of the wider picture, in terms of rights for English, the English peoples, and what with immigration and with the problems in the Middle East in terms of ISIS, I think the British and especially the English they will start sort of fighting back, so to speak. It will have an effect because they've suddenly realised they're out of the loop. They haven't got this ability to fight.
Are you including the Jewish leadership, like the Board of Deputies?
The Board of Deputies, I think, I have to admit, I am a deputy. Right? And I have been for a number of years. And it's like bashing your head against a brick wall. Right?
Or a pillow.
Right? I think they may even be rejoicing when they know I'm going to resign. Right? Because they don't get it. I mean, when I say you don't get it, that document they signed with the Muslim community, right? Great idea. The idea's great, but the timing was pathetic, right? And if you listen to the interview on the radio, our president was not strong enough to condemn what was said. So I don't know. But.
And I think that the problem with respect to the leadership of the Jewish community, that nothing has changed. When I was my name's Alan Baker. When I was heading the Jewish Student Organisation of Britain in the late 60s, I was at loggerheads with the Board of Deputies all the time because they were afraid. And you can understand why they're afraid. They're a minority. The Jewish community is a minority, and they're afraid. So things should be done quietly, behind the scenes, and under the surface, not to awaken sleeping dogs or bears or whatever. But
And nothing has changed.
Okay, but
they've been
now,
saying that for 150
okay, but my
years.
question, I had two questions. One was regarding the coordination of activities with the Israeli embassy, with the Israeli foreign ministry, and you've more or less answered that the coordination isn't really very good. And the question is whether anybody is approaching the Israeli foreign ministry to speak to the people who direct the activities of the embassy, in order to get them to wake up and give more precise instructions. That's one question. The other question is, and I ask as a lawyer, is any of this, have you had lawyers, serious lawyers in Britain, check to see whether any of the adoption of Hamas-style messages whether by the student bodies or by the TUC and the other trade unions, isn't in violation of English law, Scottish law, British law, and whether a very serious, assertive legal action could be attempted, which would perhaps give a message to everybody.
Right.
If you could add on to your answer to that question, what's Anthony Julius's role in all this?
What was that? Didn't get that.
Anthony Julius.
Okay. Answer. Your first question was about the embassy. Right. The priority of the Board of Deputies is, number one, look after the community, and number two, effectively, is stand up for Israel. Now, my personal view is that we should be standing up for Israel all the time, right? Because if Israel falls, then we fall automatically, right? But that's my personal view, and there are arguments against that, right? But so you've got to bear that in mind all the time. There is a group in Britain called UK Lawyers for Israel, which is an extremely effective group. They are looking. They're all volunteers. They are serious lawyers and QCs who give their time free of charge to look at the problems and advise accordingly. My current QC comes through the UK Lawyers for Israel, and they have been effective at grassroots council level. I think you mentioned like the flags, not so
Yes.
much the flag flying. No, I can't remember why they didn't. They took it down very quickly
One day.
in Tower Hamlets,
Yeah.
and I can't remember why. But I think
It was pressure from it was political pressure from
was
the
political.
Scottish Council of Jewish Communities.
right. But the UK Lawyers for Israel, for example, are reminding local councils that they can't cancel a contract for like Viola, for example. They can't just cancel it. They've got certain procedures that they've got to follow. So they are using lawfare. Right? You asked me about should we have a big case, right? If I put it like this to you, the unions believe that if I lose, the Jewish community will bail me out. If only. Right? That I think answers the question why there will not be a big case, because they haven't got the resources, the funds, the people willing to put their hand in their pocket and support it.
But is there any chance legally, has anybody examined legally
Oh,
whether
yeah.
it's feasible?
About 5 years ago, no, it must be longer now, must be about 8 years ago, Anthony Julius was approached to take the UCU to court then.
Who was Anthony Julius?
He was my lawyer who I worked with on my case.
He was also Deborah
Lipstadt's
Lipstadt's lawyer, and he's written a massive volume on British anti-Semitism.
He was
Called Trials
he
of the
was
Diaspora.
he was approached then, and the only way he could go forward at that time was if somebody was willing to underwrite it, and it didn't go forward because nobody at that time was willing to underwrite it, sadly, and my case only really got off the ground because we went through the employment tribunal where supposedly there is no cost, right? And that was why Anthony Julius, who worked pro bono for me, was a very good guy. We did the case. We accused the union of institutional anti-Semitism. But yeah, lawfare is good, but I don't think you're going to have the big headline case.
Because lawfare now have a fund to finance lawyers who would take on something like that.
I don't think it's so much finding somebody to do it. I think it's who's going to pay it if we lose. Who's going to pay the other side's costs?
But that's what I'm
Right?
saying.
But anyway,
No, I must say, Ronnie and I have worked together on this when I was in England, many years. And in a way, Ronnie's case has, unfortunately, the biggest effect is the personal effect on him, but it's actually made people more cautious because, in a sense, Ronnie's case was the big case. The first big legal challenge to anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism, and for various reasons, not the issue now. It lost, so that makes everybody, irrespective of finance, as you know as a lawyer, you really only want to make a big fuss about this if you're pretty sure you're going to win.
Okay.
So I think it's finance, it's will, but it's also a certain hesitancy that we can't go down that route again without being absolutely sure.
not at the moment. Not at the moment.
what you mentioned about the campuses echoes what's happening on American campuses too. And the Saudis have been funding Islamic studies on American campuses. I'd like to ask you a question about the non-Jewish community there. I've seen several videos of a Muslim member of the Parliament, British Parliament, who has quelled, the best word to use, about the
I'm
number
sure he
of
would use that
Muslims
word.
in Parliament, and that one day, and it's stated that one day the flag of Islam will fly over Buckingham Palace, which is equal to what we've heard about in videos from the United States, that one day the flag of Islam will fly over the White House. I just wonder, I also saw a video of the British police running away from mobs of Muslims, which I found very disturbing. And I wonder how the fact that a murder took place in the streets of I remember, was it London?
Yeah.
That
Drummer
British
Rigby.
soldier, does that not alarm British people that to what's coming? I mean, as you said, the situation has gotten worse. This is really nothing that has to do with just Judaism. It has to do with the welfare, the health of England, and very disturbing.
The British government is suddenly waking up and realising, hang on, we've got a problem. They've known about it for a long time. They've known about extremism is coming, right? But they have done very little. If I just tell you that as far as I know, it's only within the last 12 months that groups have started monitoring extremist Muslim speakers on campus in Britain. Right?
So that's a good sign.
Pardon?
That's a good sign.
Yes, but they've been known about it. You know, it's like
But at least they're doing something.
and it's being monitored in the last 12 months.
Came to a head of the ISIS
Yeah.
executive power.
So, one of the things to do perhaps is to correlate the Islamist violence with the anti-Semitism, because I don't know exactly how you go about it, but there's no question that there is a very strong association between anti-Zionism is the most appealing aspect of jihadi ideology in the West.
Knowing about something ahead of time, like President Obama admitted that he knew about ISIS
Yes,
long before it
he
blew
thought it
up.
was a junior
But
varsity team.
anticipating something and acting when you get a little speck, you have to act on it.
Well,
The
you can't act
impact-
at every spec.
The impact of the murder of drummer Rigby, very big at the time. I think we've heard very little since about it. I think the community, the British government is extremely worried. They're doing their best to try and think of a strategy, what they can do about all these young people going to Syria, fight in Syria. They don't know, and I think things will have to get a lot worse before they get a lot better. Before something. I don't know. It's not my area.
Right. If I could just add one thing, because I think that what you're describing about Rigby, you could extend almost across the board right to 9/11. That after 9/11, there's this huge wake up. You know, people go, oh, "What's schools?" And they fall back asleep really quite quickly. And I think that one of the things we have wake up moments, and these wake up moments seem to come. We go, now finally, and you're losing speed as you say, now finally. So I do think that one of the things we have to think about is, how to get people to wake up, and therefore what lies behind this will to deny the problem.
Fear.
That's for sure.
Yeah.
France has about 70% of the Jewish community Sephardi, 30% more or less Ashkenazi. The Sephardi community came in the last 50, 60 years, and as you talk about the grassroots level in France, today the grassroots level thinks life for Jews in France will be and is almost finished. It will be more and more difficult, so more and more are considering moving to Israel or other places.
London.
So there's a lot, I know.
Comes to London.
James, the British are going to
Yeah.
France, the French are
From
No,
Belgium also. From Belgium also,
seriously,
I know.
my wife and I are teachers, and we know that there are an awful lot of French kids coming into the Jewish school
Yeah.
system.
So what my question is, what do you think
Anything.
will bring an awakening of the situation in England by the Jewish grassroots level?
More anti-Semitism.
I don't know. I can't really answer that. I think I'm going to ask let my wife answer that.
Let me perhaps help you because when I was Israeli ambassador to Canada, and I was just quoted speaking to a Jewish event, saying that the amount of Muslim activity in Canada is increasing by the month, and the Canadians are very nice and very naive, and they don't realise it, they don't want to admit it, but very soon they're going to find themselves with a very serious problem. And a month after that, they arrested a group of Muslims who wanted to cut the head off the Prime Minister of Canada. But nevertheless, in the media, people called for me to be declared persona non grata and thrown out because I'm insulting the Canadian values. This is the tendency in Britain as well. If nothing's happening, then we shouldn't be worried, and let's forget it.
What you're actually saying about the media, the role of the media in all of this, is very important because that's where most people get their information from. And an anti-Israel narrative in the media, in the BBC, in the press, is extremely strong because we all say, well, we'll write a letter explaining the Israeli side. It won't get published because it doesn't fit the narrative. What went on? Now, I can just give you another example of my case. My case was not reported nationally. I asked a Labour journalist, why was this? And he said, because you're accusing a big union of anti-Semitism. And they don't really know how to tell their readers because it's something they haven't come across. We haven't educated our readers to accept that. And that is part of the problem. The papers are now becoming to say every week, every day you read something about extremism.
So when you lost it hit the papers?
No.
Oh, because when Kafsalti lost, then the papers reported it. But as long as it was going and when
The Jewish
you won,
community did,
they didn't
and
want
the Palestinian media, right? They on the internet, they all reported it. Oh yeah, they're full of it.
But there's a
The wake-up
correl-
call in France
Yeah.
came after Toulouse. I hate to say it, but there will be, God forbid, a Toulouse-style killing in the UK.
And then what did we do?
Yeah, but I mean, even in France, Toulouse happened, but then it really wasn't until this summer that I mean,
That was the first
Right.
instance.
but there's an interesting inverse parallel here. On the one hand, the Canadians say you're violating Canadian whatever values,
Multiculturalism.
but they don't say that about the way the Muslims behave. So that at the same time as the
Did in
press is
Australia.
playing up the terrible things that Israel does, it's systematically blanketing with silence what the Muslims are doing. So it's almost as if the nerves aren't bringing messages of pain to the brain.
But the Australian Prime Minister, he I don't know when he did it, I think it's within the last 12 months, he has basically said to the community, the Muslim community, these are our values, we don't want your values, if you don't like it here, don't live in Australia.
That may be a hoax, by the way, that letter that circulated.
I don't know.
Oh, really?
Yeah, really. He didn't say it or she didn't say it, but it keeps getting circulated. Now, what the truth is, whether there
She
was
should have
something,
said it.
like, I mean, we loved
That was a
it,
he.
but
He
you
should
gotta
have said
find the source, because I just put it out there, I think it's a hoax.
But
Unfortunately.
the Australians, I know, are extremely, how can I put this nicely, especially as the camera's going? Right? They are not. They are very strong in terms of what they believe, and if you don't believe it, they say, "Here's the door."
I hope so.
Right? They are very. They are more. We won't say that in Britain.
Right.
Right? We won't say that in Britain.
Ever?
Why not?
Why not?
I
Why
don't
not?
think-
It's got to happen at some
I think
point.
people will say that. Well, all right. I don't think the government will say these are British values. There is a sort of discussion about British values.
But a group of MPs coming out and saying it could be seriously
They'll be slaughtered in the
taken into
press, won't they?
consideration.
Well, there was discussion this summer about these British citizens who have gone to fight for ISIS not being allowed to come back to their own country. There was a big discussion about this. Even though the only citizenship they have is British, they would not be allowed back in Britain. And then there was some discussion about whether that could legally be acceptable. But the point is that they are very aware of the danger within the community of British citizens who have been radicalized and are fighting for ISIS and will be coming back. And the numbers are enormous.
If Islam is okay, ISIS is okay.
Well, no, they don't. They don't connect the two.
Well,
They
I
disconnect.
understand that. I'm making the point.
Israel and the
it's not
Palestinians
true,
is one
even
thing,
if
and it's got
it's not
nothing to
true
do with
in the
anything
Jerusalem
else.
Centre for Public Affairs. Islam is not ISIS. ISIS may be part of Islam, but Islam is bigger than ISIS, and we should keep the discourse at a reasonable
Well,
level.
that's my next question. If I have you said something about the deputies putting out a statement that you agreed with, and then you took issue with something. What was it in the statement that you thought was valid?
Oh, this is the
This
joint
is
statement.
the joint
Right.
statement with the Muslim
Yes, that
community of Britain.
To what effect?
I was very upset that they signed up an agreement to fight Islamophobia and anti-Semitism was unacceptable. They made comments about Israel, about Gaza. I can't remember exactly, but I think it was something along the lines of being an occupied area, or it was it? Leslie, please help me here.
Well, I'm not briefed to talk about it, but it was an attempt, misguided or otherwise, at the time of towards the end of the second phase of Executive Age, when it was going to be.
Well, what did you agree with? That's what I was.
They agreed that the event should not, what the purpose of it was, not to damage Muslim Jewish relations in the UK. And to try
Are they of any value? I mean, this is why I'm zeroing
to
in.
find some
I don't believe in
ground.
interfaith dialogue, and it bothers me that it would be given that stature of a high level that there's something to talk to these people about.
Well, there is something to talk to the Muslim community. Ronnie himself said this may not be the right time, and that's, I think,
That
There's
was-
never a right time.
Well,
I mean, I'm
that was
taking
the point
issue
of view.
with that
That is
mentality.
the point of view. But if you're in the UK
Yeah.
and you have a Muslim community that is actually, I think, about 8 times the size of the Jewish community,
Right.
and you want good as there are generally good relationships. If you go around the Jewish communities in the UK, you have lots of evidence of rabbis and imams working together in communities and all sorts of good things going on, which can only be to the good of community relations in the UK. And what they're saying is we differ, or some of us differ, on what is going on in Israel and Palestine with the Palestinian people.
Well, okay.
And therefore we have to find a way of working together despite that. Now whether the terms of what they said were correct, I'm sure to most people living in Israel, including me, knowing what is going on here, they were irritating, and to some people they would have been offensive. But the goal of it was that, and you can criticise it, it's in line with their view, as Ronnie has been saying, of trying to keep things behind the scenes
Yeah.
and on this level at the right level.
Can I just add
And
something? Can I just add something?
So I'm sure they said things that we would not like
Right.
living in Israel.
The statement inferred that some of the Israeli attacks were disproportionate, right? And how I cannot understand how the leader of the president of the Board of Deputies can sign a document that says that. They didn't read the Muslim, I think it was the Muslim Council of Britain, they didn't read their website. If you look at their website, they had links with Hamas-based organisations. Their statements on Gaza were pro-Palestinian, condemning the Israeli actions.
So what value was the joint statement? I don't get it, why you would support it, or why...
No, the joint statement
I don't get
didn't.
it.
No, the joint statement didn't. The Muslim Council of Britain website did. Right? So how could you say, yeah, okay, we'll put that to one side, but I'll sign this
You
sort of
can't,
French.
you supported it. You said I agreed
personally
with
didn't.
it.
I personally
he disagreed.
No,
I
he-
disagreed with it.
He said
I know
only
I
the
say
sign.
You said
But
the
he
timing
said
you
there are
disagreed with.
elements in it
No,
that he agreed
I
with.
said the idea of getting what I meant to say,
Okay.
and I apologise because I frequently do get things round the wrong way. I meant to say that the idea of Jews and Muslims coming together was great, but it was the wrong time.
So I challenge that basic premise.
Is that right?
I challenge that basic premise.
Very good.
All right. Any other questions, comments?
I'm following up what Leslie was just saying, where I would be supportive but go a step further. Is I think that these radical elements internal to a given country are a threat to the democracy of that country. Mamash. And that the British government has a role to play in determining what are these radical elements. In this case, we're talking about radical Islamic elements. There are other, perhaps, radical elements. And it's not just when they leave the country, Brits, to fight with the Islamic State, but it's within Britain itself. And the question is, how do you define, it's a governmental role, how do you define what is radical and potentially eating away at our society and our democracy? And deal with that on that level. That I don't feel is happening. And potentially in the United States as well, in their pockets now. But we're seeing it countrywide in many countries of Europe, and that to me is the great issue in Britain, France, and elsewhere at the moment.
Say so, and you will be declared persona non grata.
But the British government, I appreciate what you're saying, but I think that's BS.
Right.
Alan, that's BS, because the government has to realize that these are threats to its fundamental democracy.
They don't want to realise that.
No, so
But
wait,
they
wait,
have
wait.
to,
They don't
or the
want to,
democracy
but
will
they don't
fall
want
one
to,
day.
but they're eventually going to have to. And actually, I was thinking as you were talking about the definition of anti-Semitism, everybody knows the joke that an anti-Semite is somebody who hates Jews more than absolutely necessary. And I think that one of the new definitions that we might go for gets right at the point that you're making, which is the definition of anti-Semitism is when you hate Jews even though it's hurting you. And that's what's happening. The Europeans are so addicted to these lethal narratives about Jews misbehaving that they are literally feeding the fires of jihad in their midst just in order to be able to tell these nasty stories about us. And I think that one of the major elements that we have to, one of the ways to wake people up is every time something like this happens, draw their attention to the link between their embrace of an anti-Semitic narrative, which they'll say isn't anti-Semitic, it's anti-Zionist, but in fact shows such self-destructive tendencies.
I think that there is a group of lawyers that you're not looking to. I don't know about the UK lawyers for Israel, but when I was a young lawyer 50 years ago in Washington, D.C., Georgetown University accepted funding from Saudi Arabia for a project, which violated American law because Jews were not allowed to participate. There was a group of young lawyers who had just gotten into practice, and we didn't have a lot of work to do, but we were glad to volunteer to work on this project, and we got Georgetown to back down and to refuse the money because they were in danger of losing federal funding by violating the law. I don't think you need a big case. We didn't have to go to court. We just did the research, presented it to the university, and said, here, you're in trouble. You could be.
This is what Eugene Kontorovich has done with the American Studies Association.
Well, what I'm suggesting is in Great Britain, I don't know how many Jewish law students there are, but I'll bet there are a lot of them.
Yeah.
And
Not as many as you
plus,
think.
which you have some very, very knowledgeable retired judges. I'm thinking of Lady Cosgrove, and who are very dynamic and would be delighted to do stuff like this. And I think that instead of going to the big name QCs, who are very busy and are doing pro bono work and working on big cases, this little stuff where you just do the research and you go to the university management and you say, look here, here's the stuff. You're violating the law. We're not going to bring the case yet. We could, but look what you're doing. You're in danger. And I think law students, Jewish law students, would love to participate, and young lawyers.
We've known for a long time, chase the money, see where the money goes. There's an awful lot of Middle East money going into our universities. Exeter, for one.
And it may be in violation of British law.
I don't know. LSE was involved with Libya a few years ago, right, and getting money from Gaddafi. They had to withdraw or return, or they did something. They were very embarrassed by it. The universities are receiving an awful lot of Middle East money. Exeter, as I said, but it's a question of finding somebody who's activist, somebody who's willing to do it.
Well, but that's what I'm saying.
Right.
Young lawyers who are not that busy but need to get known in their communities. Love. This is what we did.
Yeah.
I mean, I've been out of law school 6 months when I was involved in one of these groups, and it was a delight because I wasn't that busy, and neither were the other young lawyers. But we had time and energy, and we wanted our communities to recognize us.
I think you're very right. If we can sort of get some of these grassroots people who were involved came out in
go to the law schools.
Can I I'll throw
Get their
something
graduates
else
list and
back at
contact
you.
the graduates.
Not back at you personally, but I'll bring another topic up, which I haven't actually touched on. You may have read about the Trojan horse scandal in British schools.
The schools, right?
Yes.
In the schools, right? Basically, from Muslims, right, wanting to indoctrinate their students.
The infidels.
Oh, Haredi. Right. And that's been a scandal, but there has been I can't think of the word. Backlash. There's been a backlash on Jewish schools and other faith schools because of that. Our schools, the Jewish schools, have been inspected, right, in the on the grounds of, got to be fair here in terms of our society. Multicultural, can't just focus on the Muslims, got to focus on the other one. Jewish Free School, the JFS, has been downgraded in its ability, I think, from outstanding into just good, right? And one of the effects of this is that educating our students about Israel and about the Middle East conflict, right, is under discussion. How can we do this in light of the Trojan horse scandal post this? How can we do this in our Jewish schools? And we've got to do it very carefully within the law that we will send students to school with to university with even less knowledge of Israel and less streetwise than they are already, right? And that is another serious problem, which is the outcome of all these sort of effects that are going on relating to our
Well, it's
society.
always easy to say what you can't do.
All right. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you for the.
It's